king, dabbles a few words in a proclamation, in a charter. And eventually it leads to, so this border, this border, this border, kind of this border, not this bit, you'll find out about later. But all of those bits, probably 99% of Pennsylvania was already established as soon as the king made his charter in 1681. And that has impacted this area ever since. Welcome to Tingledom. Just real quick before we get into it, just wanted to tell you about an idea I've had. I've been thinking I could do a little series called 7 Days of Maps, where we'd look through geography, like probably North America, but I was thinking maybe we'd do like a different century every day, but really focus on the cartography. I don't know, what do you think? I think it's a good idea. Well, anyway, we should probably get on to the purpose of today's session. Pennsylvania. So we'll start with the same map that we did last month on Delaware. And that is because we're looking at this similar area. Obviously, we've got, Delaware down here, and then New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And the Lenape were the major groups in these areas. And so it's just important to remember that these are the people who inhabited these areas for a very long time. It's actually thought that perhaps about 5,000 years ago there were a different group of Native American peoples there, but for another time. So the Lenape are who the early Pennsylvanians would have been dealing with over in the western side of the state. Gets a little bit more into the Iroquois nation, and we do have a map that addresses some of the different groups there, and that actually is a European map from the time. So really nice that we do actually have a few maps that pay homage to those native peoples from that time. So our next map is one that you'll also recognize. This is our Kartkas over Nya Sverige, and this has to do with New Sweden, and then we'll have a New Netherland map as well. This is obviously the one that was not current for the time. This one was made in 1900s, early 1900s. So if you see Christina, Wilmington here, then north of here is Pennsylvania. So we still have these similar spots which go into Pennsylvania. And so you do see a similar history between Delaware and Pennsylvania there, because it follows that similar Dutch, Swedish, Dutch sort of pattern. So I'm not going to cover that in a lot of detail since we went in a bit of detail last time. And it's just this, really, if you think about Pennsylvania, it's just this southeast corner there. And then next month when we talk about New Jersey, we'll probably pull the map out again. So next we'll look at New Netherland, as I said, which this is the first time we will have looked at this map. But it may be a style that you recognize. If you remember our maps of Godden's Bay, or Delaware Bay, but when it was in New Netherland, largest maps. He had training in art, so had quite a passion for art as well, and then he was a trained cartographer. So those two aspects for him would come together. And so here we're mainly looking, if you notice, we'll be looking at, this is where the Delaware Bay would be. So this side of the Svit River, which we call the Delaware River, is Pennsylvania, and then up through here as well. And the story follows a very similar trajectory in the beginning. And that is because all of the New Netherland and the New Sweden colonies were in these areas and didn't follow what had ended up eventually being the English and then American borders. So, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, we're seeing a similar story. Which then ends for them with 1664. The Duke of York takes over, specifies that they have the earlier claim, and backs that up with the might of military, and so is quite successful. And that is when we then get to the beginning of Pennsylvania. So 1664 is when the English laid claim to this area, and then it was 1681 when Pennsylvania was declared. So to tell that story, we're going to look at this fairly early map of Pennsylvania. And so this is the Novi Belgi map made by Nicholas Fisher in the 1690s. We don't have an exact date, but you'll see Pennsylvania here. So first, since I always like to talk about the names, Pennsylvania, which it did have the name from the beginning, unlike the lower counties on the Delaware, which got its name much later. Bit of an odd one, that. But anyway. So Pennsylvania, the Penn portion of that comes not from the proprietor of Pennsylvania, but his father, who was also William Penn. And so Penn from there. And then Sylvania, which is a Latin word for woods, so basically means Penn's woods. Now, William Penn, the son, who will be William Penn from here on, unless we specifically mention the father, he did not want to name it Pennsylvania because he thought everyone would think he was naming it after himself. But his father had passed on by that point, and the king had a rather close relationship with William Penn the Elder, and so thought he should be honored by having the name. So the story of William Penn's life before we get to 1681 is a rather interesting one. So his father was in the military and served with the king. He went to battle with him. I think he may have saved his life. And then after the war, he lent him a large sum of money for another matter, for another colony, because the king didn't think it was appropriate for that to come out of the royal budget, essentially. And so he wanted to use private funds, but he didn't have enough, and so he took a loan from William Penn. Now, at the same time, so his son, William Penn, or main William Penn, he was actually quite a divisive figure in that his father, while he was still alive, was not the happiest because he had been converted over to Quakerism, or the Society of Friends. That's what they called themselves, and Quaker was a bit of a slur, I suppose, but for ease we'll use it since that's what most people know them as, the Quakers. So when he was 17, they moved to Ireland. He met a Quaker preacher and was really taken with the ideals and the ideas espoused by the Quakers. And it's quite interesting because if you see the connections between a lot of American culture, a lot of it does stem back to those Quaker ideals. One of their ideals was that they would not show respect to their social betters. So they wouldn't take off a hat or pay the due deference that was expected at that time in the social hierarchy. And the problem for William Penn and other Quakers was that England at this time was not the most religiously tolerant area. And so he was thrown into jail multiple times. And so were lots of Quakers. The movement grew, and as it grew, there was more resistance from the crown about the Quakers. And so up to 10,000 might have been jailed this time. So it happened then that New Jersey, which we'll get to next month, but New Jersey, they were having a bit of a dispute, and the dispute was between two proprietors who were both Quakers. And so, because William Penn was quite well known and respected as somebody who respected Quakers, but also as a gentleman, his aid was sought in sorting out the issue between the two of them. This was in 1674. And I think it's my opinion, that it was then that Penn began to really consider the idea of a colony, where all this religious persecution could be across the ocean, and it could be a society for Quakers to come, and he could set up his ideal society. So he began planning, and he seemed very excited about these plans, and he was fortunate in that the king owed his father, which now went to him, a tremendous debt of money that the king was not going to be able to repay. And so he asked if instead of having that debt, if he could have it paid in land and he could start a colony. And I think that the king saw it as killing two birds with one stone. Be able to get rid of the debt that he'd been carrying without having to spend any money. And if Penn was going to take some Quakers off of his hands, that would probably make his life easier, not having to keep throwing people in jail for breaking the law. And so it was declared 1681. Look at Pennsylvania. So the land of Pennsylvania were declared as the eastern border would be the Delaware River, which I'm not sure, I think this is where they've got it here. So you would have the Delaware River, and it would be between, does this one have, I don't think it's actually listed. Oh, they have 40 here. Yeah. So it's going to be between 40 and 43 north, and then it should run from 5 degrees west of the eastern border, which a bit later there were different interpretations because William Penn took it as that it should basically be a parallel border to the Delaware River, whereas most everyone else thought, let's just make it a straight line. So that's what we ended up with, of course. So it was important to William Penn when setting up his colony. He had known about different colonies and not having very good relations with the Native American population. And he didn't want that. He wanted to be able to have good relationships with them. And he wrote that and codified that in the charter for Pennsylvania and how it should be set up. And so he arranged with the Lenape of that area to purchase the lands. One of the big issues with purchasing in those days came down to basically permanent property rights. Native Americans had more of the concept of selling rights to be able to come and hunt in the lands, but not that they would forever be giving up access to particular lands. I think by the time Penn had come along, I think there was a bit more of an understanding there. And so it was progressively, but when Penn moved on, and it was his son and others running the colony, the relations with Native Americans were probably not quite as ethical as one would wish with a modern perspective, I suppose. But so he did arrange, and he wanted to have really good relationships, and from all accounts, they did maintain good relationships with the local Native Americans around the Philadelphia area for the early colonies. So Penn didn't end up staying in the colony, ended up going back and forth. In the 1690s, he stayed a little bit longer because the person who had gotten him into Quakerism had died, so he stuck around to give a eulogy at the funeral. And then he got thrown in jail again, and the proprietorship of the colony actually got taken away. There was drama between him and the crown because they wanted him to be contributing to the defense of the colonies. And the Quakers didn't want to, and basically he agreed that they would contribute to the defense, and then he got his colony back. So, but he was in and out of jail his whole life. He was actually, right before his death, considering giving up the colony so it could be a royal colony. But he ended up dying before that transaction was completed. And his second wife took over, and she didn't want part of that. She wanted to keep the colony, and her son ended up taking charge as well. But before he died, we have this map. This is of Philadelphia. It's really interesting. It's also one of the laws that he put in was that anybody clearing land, for every 5 acres that they cleared, they had to leave 1 acre of forest intact. So almost one of the earliest conservation laws in the English part of that area. Obviously, Native Americans were doing a pretty good job of conserving the natural environment. But you can just see right here along the Delaware River and laid out in a fairly nice grid pattern. You can see our trees and all the rivers. You can see why they would have chosen this spot, because being able to get water to do the movement for you, very important then, and it's still actually quite important nowadays. We have a lot of goods that are moved via water. So now we'll get past William Penn into the 1730s. So we have this map, a map of the British Empire in America. This comes from Henry Popple, and you can see it's a really nice overview of the understanding of the colonies at that time. So you can see Pennsylvania here, the river forming this border, and then we would have 40 and 43, and this should be 5 degrees across. But of course this isn't quite what our modern Pennsylvania looks like. So we'll want to figure out how do we get to our modern version. But first I have a couple really cool maps to show you. So this map comes from 1753. And you can see the size of it, but I haven't had to really scale it down. This is about the size it would have been printed, because it was printed actually in a gentleman's magazine. And we see Philadelphia in the center here, but again we see the rivers and the waterways. But by 1753 you can see all these other settlements that had spread out from Philadelphia. But the other map I wanted to show you, you maybe would think this comes from an earlier time, since we have quite sophisticated maps by the middle of the 1700s. But this is because this, if you see right here, we've got the Allegheny Mountains, or the Appalachian Mountains. So the corner we've been looking at will be here, so we're actually looking at the other part of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And so this is Captain Snow's sketch of the country by himself, and the best account he could receive from the Indian traders in 1754. So you've got lots of interesting notes here. So Lake Erie, communication with the river St. Lawrence, the Twitty Nation, which Governor Dinderby went to meet. And you just have all these little pieces, like French Creek, where they bring their canoes to the Allegheny or Mississippi rivers. Just little cool things like that. But what's interesting is, so we have this, but this is also the area that we see impacted by the Proclamation Act, which came in 1766, which was just after the end of the French and Indian War, which said that there could be no new settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains. The Iroquois chieftains are the ones who kind of pled with the king, saying that people kept homing in on their lands, and so he set aside those lands for the Native Americans, at least for the time being. Which, because revolution broke out in just 10 years later, didn't really get much chance to see how much he would follow through on that. But now we're back to our original map. This is the 1756 map of the province of Pennsylvania. And this was done by Thomas Kitchen to figure out when our borders were settled. So this was 1754, this map. So only the river border had been settled at this point. It was in 1769 that Mason and Dixon came and did the border with Maryland. And then in 1774 is when New York and Pennsylvania were able to settle the boundary in this area. So at that point, Pennsylvania didn't have access to a lake. Basically, they were squared off in a way that they weren't having access to Lake Erie. Because if we look at the finalized borders, they didn't yet have what we'll call the Erie Triangle. Interesting story how they got it. So lots of states at the end of the war were ceding lands to the United States government to repay their war debts. New York was one of them. In 1782, they yielded all of their lands that were west of this line. So that brought this into contention. But at that point, it was part of Connecticut, actually. But in 1792, that was when Pennsylvania then purchased the Erie Triangle, so that they could have then access to Lake Erie, which is very beneficial for them strategically. And it's just shortly after that that we get this map. This map is from 1810, and so that is when that would have been, just a decade or so after they got the triangle. But this is the silhouette that we know New Jersey by: flat on the bottom, flat at the top, except for this little triangle. And almost these two little triangles here, which are formed by the Delaware River. And so that is Pennsylvania, the second state. They ratified the Constitution on the 12th of December, 1787. And that is when they became the second